You cannot write in science fiction, you certainly cannot read it very much and deal in these terms across whole galaxies without realizing that sexual equality is as basic as any other kind of equality. This does not mean that in future pictures I will ever stop using women as sex objects, as I will not. But to be fair, we have always used and will be continuing to use males as sex objects too. As a matter of fact, when I was younger and much more agile, I've been used as a sex object myself. I think it's great fun. But we really believe that. We believed it even back in '63 when we were making the first pilot and laying out the Star Trek series idea. And in those days, we had the Enterprise 50% men, 50% women. Would you believe we received another one of those network visits? The fellow this time said, you can't do that. We said, why on earth not? These are exact quotes. He said, because don't you see, it will make it look like there's a lot of fooling around going on up there. We had a huge argument. He went away, came back a week later and said, we've had a meeting on this whole subject, and if you want your series, we're going to make you a one-time offer. You can have 30% women. And I thought, well, hell, 30% healthy young women should be able to handle the ship, so I just let the thing. You cannot get fully inside Star Trek without getting to know DeForest Kelley. In real life, he often seems more a 23rd century human being than any of us. Witness what this intelligent, witty man had to say when we talked recently.
Well, yes, of course that happens. DeForest Kelley and Dr. McCoy are part of each other. It's impossible for me to give a character that much of my emotion, identify with him that strongly, for that length of time, without fiction and reality beginning to meld somewhat.
Then you're saying, Dee, that if you played Jack the Ripper, he'd be part DeForest Kelley, and Kelley would be affected by what the killer was?
Certainly. If I played him as an actor should, that is, feeling his needs, thinking his thoughts. You see, everyone play acts a little bit, Gene. Children most of all, because it's a valuable aid in choosing what kind of person you want to be, or what kind of person you don't want to be. And naturally, since I don't want to be Jack the Ripper, it's easy for me to disengage after that rolls over. But now that when you start talking about Dr. McCoy, you begin to talk about a completely different case. He has some human qualities that are really worth emulating.
How far does that emulating him go, Dee?
You mean, do I ever think I am Dr. McCoy?
Yeah.
Oh, of course not.
An amazing number of people relate to you that way, don't they?
Yes, that's true.
Do they ask for medical advice ever?
Oh, no, Gene. Now, you know our fans are brighter than that. They know I'm not really McCoy. But something about our show seemed to give, I don't know. I guess hope is the best word. You know, the most heartbreaking letters I receive come from parents and even the children themselves who have some kind of permanent illness or even a terminal illness.
You visited some of these children, haven't you?
Yes, I've been able to visit some, and I try to correspond with everyone who writes that type of letter.
This is a difficult question. Like, what did your visit do? How did you feel? How could you possibly help them?
Well, the answer is still hope. Not necessarily that I brought any hope they'd get well, you understand. The hope seems to be, I guess, in imagination and dreams.
But those particular dreams won't come true for those children.
Well, maybe kids are smarter than us. They think dreams do come true. You see, if we can imagine better ways, a happier life, a better world, then somehow, if you can believe it will happen, it will happen. And we're all going to be a part of it someday, Gene. I'm beginning to sound like the ship's chaplain. We better get back to some medicine.
I've noticed that you do share McCoy's interest in medicine.
Well, after all, I spent 3 years of my life not really portraying, being a doctor, making myself think as a physician thinks, feeling a physician's responsibilities, his values, his needs. If you do that, how can you not begin examining medicine today and thinking about what it will become in the Star Trek century?
Okay, medicine today. What do you think of it?
It's too expensive.
Come on, Dean, that's a pretty safe generality.
Is it? Look, when millions of inhabitants on any planet can't afford medical care, then it's obviously too damned expensive. Now, if you want to ask what I think of medical care that is available...
I've noticed you do seem to be critical of medicine today.
Well, like anything else, Gene, medicine reflects the society it's part of, just as our 20th century has tried to find happiness outside ourselves in material things. I think our medicine today has too often tried to find its answers outside the human body. In other words, in technology or pharmacology or in sometimes physically assaulting the body. Now, I'm not criticizing our physicians, understand. That just happens to be the state of the art today. They save a lot of lives. They save a lot of lives, just as doctors once had to cut off all gangrenous limbs in order to save a lot of lives.
Well, Dave, we're getting into that thing we've talked about before, right?
That's right. And I'll tell you something. I'm even more certain of it now, Gene. And look, when Star Trek is made again, we've just got to have some scenes of medicine the way it's going to be. You see, I see the physician as less a mechanic or a chemist, but more a teacher. In other words, teaching the patient to use the natural healing ability we all have in our bodies. And our natural healing ability is incredible. Absolutely incredible. Most top doctors today will admit that we're on the edge of just such a medical revolution. We can no longer ignore the mounting evidence that infection and disease have much to do with the state of our conscious and our subconscious mind.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I remember on stage we used to say we're all too busy to catch a cold, and none of us ever did.
And you know, a surprising number of people have cured themselves of diseases ranging from everything from athlete's foot to cancer, and some were never even aware they were healing themselves. Plus the fact that our best physicians are no longer laughing at things like, well, witch doctors, yoga, Zen, Christian Science, acupuncture, meditation, and so on. Our bodies are incredibly sophisticated and capable machines. And it's time that we begin respecting those bodies for what they are and begin learning what they can do.
And what do we do until we get to that point?
Well, the next best thing is still to keep warm and to drink plenty of liquids. And in your case, Gene, I'm sure you're going to do both.
Probably the most often asked question about the show is why the Star Trek phenomenon. And this is, incidentally, not just a fan or a Trekkie question. It is now being asked by communications experts, by sociologists, educators, and others. There have already been a couple of master's theses written on this, and there are a couple of doctorates presently at work. And it could be an important question because you can ask, how can a simple space opera with blinking lights and zap guns and a hobgoblin with pointy ears reach out and touch the hearts and minds of literally millions of people and become a cult in some cases? Obviously, what this means is that television has incredible power. They're saying that if a Star Trek can do this, then perhaps another carefully calculated show could move people in other directions. What's to keep selfish interests from creating other cults for selfish purposes, industrial cartels, political parties, and governments. Ultimate power in this world, as you know, has always been one simple thing: the control and manipulation of minds. Fortunately, any attempt, however, to manipulate people through any so-called Star Trek formula is doomed to failure, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. First of all, our show did not reach, in effect, all these people because it was deep and great literature. Star Trek was not Ibsen or Shakespeare. To get a primetime show, network show on the air, and to keep it there, you must attract and hold a minimum of 18 million people every week. You have to do that in order to woo people away from Gomer Pyle, Bonanza, Beverly Hillbillies, and so on. And we tried to do this with entertainment, action, adventure, conflict, and so on. But once we got on the air, and within the limits of those action and adventure limits, we did not accept the myth that the television audience has an infantile mind. We had an idea, and we had a premise. Thank you, and we still believe that. As a matter of fact, we decided to risk the whole show on that premise. We believe that the often ridiculed mass audience is sick of this world's petty nationalism and all its old ways and old hatreds, and that people are not only willing but anxious to think beyond those petty beliefs that have for so long kept mankind divided. So you see that the formula, the magic ingredient that many people keep seeking and many of them keep missing is really not in Star Trek. It is in the audience. There is an intelligent life form out on the other side of that television tube. The whole show was an attempt to say that humanity will reach maturity and wisdom on the day that it begins not just to tolerate, but to take a special delight in differences in ideas and differences in life forms. We tried to say that the worst possible thing that can happen to all of us is for the future to somehow press us into a common mold where we begin to act and talk and look and think alike. If we cannot learn to actually enjoy those small differences, take a positive delight in those small differences between our own kind here on this planet, then we do not deserve to go out into space and meet the diversity that's almost certainly out there. And I think this is what people responded to. The result of that was 7 years after being dropped by the network of saying those things, there are now more people watching it than ever before. And if you ascribe those things to any mystic or scriptural brilliance in Star Trek, you miss the entire point. What Star Trek proves, as faulty as individual episodes could be, is that the much maligned common man and common woman has an enormous hunger for brotherhood. They are ready for the 23rd century now, and they are light years ahead of their petty governments and their visionless leaders. In 1965, I took the first Star Trek pilot to Tricon at Cleveland, a science fiction convention. And when they began to show my pilot, I noticed a gentleman standing nearby. I heard a gentleman standing nearby, surrounded by people beginning to talk as my show came on. And nervously, I hurried over to him and said, "For Christ's sakes, be quiet. They've got my pilot on." Someone then walked up to me and said, "Congratulations, you've just insulted Isaac Asimov." I don't know if you remember that incident, Ike.
No, I don't, but it rings true because I'm always talking.
Well, the point of it I remember is after the show was over, the man that I had always wanted to meet, my idol in science fiction, Isaac Asimov, came over and apologized and said, "You're quite right, I shouldn't have been talking," and then said some nice things about the pilot, and it was the start of a long friendship. Here's probably one of the oldest questions that, to you. What is science fiction?
Well, I don't know that I'm particularly an expert on this, despite the fact I've written a great many books. But I've always said that science fiction is that branch of literature which deals with the response of human beings to changes in science and technology. Now that's a rough and ready description of science fiction, but a lot of people ask me, how do I differentiate science fiction from fantasy? That's the second most favorite question among science fiction people. And to my way of thinking, that although science fiction and fantasy both deal with a background which is completely different from the normal background that exists today, in fantasy there is no way in which we can travel from our background to the fantastic background, which may involve magic, elves, fairies, and so on. But we can, at least conceivably, travel from our background to the science fictional background by appropriate changes in the level of science and technology.
You've written some 110 books, perhaps more. Is the Foundation the one you'd like to be remembered for, or is it another one?
I think the Foundation trilogy is, whether I like it or not, the one I'm going to be most nearly remembered for. That is, if I'm remembered at all. My own favorite science fiction book is The Gods Themselves. In my nonfiction, I presume Asimov's Guide to Science is the most nearly famous book I've written, although the trouble with that is it goes out of date unless I continually keep updating it.
It's the one that I've used most, and in the making of Star Trek, it sat on my desk most of the time. I think you've seen more new writers happen, new science fiction writers, than most have. How about a quick course for would-be science fiction writers? What are the most common mistakes you think are made in the field?
Well, from my standpoint, the most common mistake a science fiction writer makes is to downgrade science. Now, these days particularly, many science fiction writers have very little to do with science, and many science fiction stories have very little to do with science. But whether a science fiction story has science or not, it is impossible to write a good one if you are completely ignorant of science. You will make mistakes even when you think science isn't involved. I think that it is important to at least know something about science, whether you're going to put science in or not. It shows. As a matter of fact, that's what makes the difference between Star Trek and all the other science fiction series that I have seen. Star Trek was the only one when whoever it was who was involved, Gene, and I mention no names, insisted on people knowing something about science and preparing and it showed, you know. You could see that even when you broke the laws of science, you were doing it intelligently and plausibly. There are other science fiction shows, no names please, in which it is quite clear that the writers and the producer know nothing about science and don't care, and that shows too, and it is impossible to be a self-respecting viewer and accept it.
Well, you're not saying to the young writer that he must be anything near a scientist. He just has to have respect for it and be willing to research it when it's used in, that particular point is used in a story.
Absolutely.
How about the same question regarding science fiction movies as opposed to novels? What is your principal criticism concerning them? The same thing?
Well, I tell you, science fiction movies have a special difficulty that books do not have. They have to deal with a much larger audience. If a book sells 5,000 copies, it's viable. A movie has to sell 40 million, so to speak, which means that they cannot play for the minority the way a book can. In a book, you can be pretty highbrow and figure, well, there are 5,000 people who will like this. A movie has to hit, in some respects, the lowest common denominator.
There should be quite a few people playing this record who appreciate this question. Like, your literary output ranks at the top in both volume and quality. Typically, when your name came up with Ray Bradbury the other day, he simply described you in 3 words: that incredible man. What is your advice to the would-be writer, beyond the usual advice, write?
Well, it seems to me that the writer must use all things human, and all things human-made, and all things that impinge upon the human being as his raw material, which you can say briefly, he uses the universe as his raw material. So the writer must go through life with his eyes and ears open. He must allow everything to flood in and ignore nothing.
What you're saying is really that the beginnings of being a good science fiction writer is first to be interested in the reality around you.
I think so, yes.
We are recording this for a Columbia record tonight, and the record company said, why don't you write a typical memo, an honest one of the kind you actually get back from a network when they want to censor your show. And so I've done that, and in order to show you how they censor, pretend with me that we have submitted a script to them based on a classic. In fact, let's choose the best-selling book of all time. Here is exactly the kind of memo we'd get back. Gentlemen, reference your script, the Bible. We are concerned with the story's preoccupation with violence, sex, nudity, and other television code violations. We are particularly concerned over your story protagonist, God, who seems to us completely unmotivated and rather bloodthirsty. Also, this principal character, as presently written, seems to us highly prejudiced in the favor of a single tribe. We remind you that the television code requires equal treatment of blacks, Asians, Chicanos, American Indians, and other minority groups. Exactly as it would come, so help me. We are equally concerned with the characterization of the principal character's son, who is portrayed in wildly inflammatory, revolutionary conduct, which appears to ridicule wealth, banking and loan advertisers, and the American way of life. His attitudes must be clearly labeled to impressionable young television viewers as reprehensible. Specifically, and they always have a list of things that you've got to change. Please delete references to God making woman out of Adam's rib. This network is an equal opportunities employer with commitments to female equality. Opening sequences are too suggestive. Delete language "and both were naked." Their subsequent apron of fig leaves will not be a suitable garment in the case of the female. Also, the tempting of the female by the serpent seems to have sexual connotations. Recommend serpent be substituted with frog or badger. Caution in excessive violence throughout, particularly the case of God drowning over 99% of mankind. Also, we must question the story logic of having an all-knowing, all-powerful central character who creates faulty humans and then blames them for his own mistakes. In order to make this character more sympathetic, please delete his exhibitions of wrath and also any indications of a personality insecurity, such as his constant demands for praise. Sons and daughters of Noah cannot be shown and described as repopulating Earth, as television code forbids ancestral relationships. Recommend a fleet of arks. Or perhaps strong swimmers from other families can be saved. Delete continual references to virgins. Such description of the character Mary is acceptable as a story point, but only if it is clearly indicated that her relationship with main character is totally platonic. Otherwise, a marriage ceremony must be indicated. Specifics in the portrayal of their son: he cannot be shown as practicing medicine without a license. Delete his biased political views, such as peace at all costs, his mocking of established courts and judicial systems, and his ridiculing of normal attitudes toward capitalism, profit, and the laying up of treasures. All of this is further aggravated by your description of the character. Must he be shown as bearded and barefoot? In summary, a rather extensive rewrite seems indicated. It is suggested that the writers be constantly guided by the question, is this suitable for family hour viewing? The letter was from Columbia Records. Dear Gene, is there a story behind Star Trek which hasn't been told? An intimate or very personal beginning? If so, we think it belongs on the Inside Star Trek record. All right, I can talk about things now that would have embarrassed me once. And maybe my story could be helpful to you if you're somehow different from other people, or handicapped. Most of us are in one way or another. I guess Star Trek had its first beginnings in the fact that as a child I was different, handicapped. I had difficulty breathing, eyes that didn't work well in bright sunlight, spindly-legged, weak, uncoordinated. I wasn't a very pretty thing, and I suffered the awful embarrassments that only a child can feel. I don't suppose every writer has to start like that, but If I had been the things that I dreamed of being, agile, athletic, admired and popular, I know now that I never would have ended up with as happy a life. I became a reader. Thank God I became a reader. I lived in a dream world because it was a hell of a lot better world. I was Dr. Doolittle. I was Zane Grey's lonely cowboy, an explorer. Lots of the trash. I was an Indian fighter, fearless soldier, a fighter race. If you read Peanuts, I was Snoopy. I fought the Red Baron many times. Certainly, part of Star Trek was written by that boy, dreaming maybe as you do of a better world in which people would look past our exteriors and see whatever loveliness we have inside us. I remember being about 8 years old in the backyard, sitting in a soap carton, pretending that it was a great vessel of some kind, and the bold, strong person hidden inside of me, he was the captain. I remember it was an enclosed vessel because I had a second soap carton pulled down over my head. After sitting there for several hours, still encased in soap cartons, I heard the concerned voices of my parents speculating whether my illness had led to brain damage. Ah, how lovely all our daughters are inside. How fearless all our sons, if only we could see it. I remember helping my father clean the garage. Actually, he was cleaning. I was facing the firing squad. The bullets caught me, spun me to the ground, and as I lay there, bravely dying, I looked up to see Dad watching me with pity on his face, assuming I was suffering some new kind of seizure. Years later, something brought me back to reality. Science fiction. Yes, incredible. Science fiction taught me how to live in the real world. Thank you, Homer, my ex-convict friend. Thank you for John Carter of Mars. It made your cage more bearable. It helped rescue me from mine. And thank you, Claude, for that first copy of Astounding Stories magazine. Sorry you didn't reach 16 and grow out of your illness as I did. I was lucky, a miracle of adolescence. My body mended. I actually became stronger than average. But science fiction saved me from that too. Saved me from the perils of a strong body. I learned by then that reality is incredibly larger, infinitely more exciting than the flesh and blood vehicle we travel in here. If you read science fiction, the more you read it, the more you realize that you and the universe are part of the same thing. Science still knows practically nothing about the real nature of matter, energy, dimension, or time, and even less about those remarkable things called life and thought. But whatever the meaning and purpose of this universe, you are a legitimate part of it. And since you are part of the all that is, part of its purpose, there is more to you than just this brief speck of existence. You are just a visitor here in this time and this place, a traveler through it. What a difference that makes. As a traveler here, it no longer crushes you that this world is not always fair or orderly or understandable. Your passport allows you to fix what you can, to love, to refuse to take part in ugliness. But meanwhile, you are delighted that this is such a varied, colorful, exciting place. As a traveler, you're not here to judge, but to experience. You begin to feel a new affection for the life forms here. You no longer feel threatened that some may be greater or lesser than you. It's only important that you've been given this marvelous opportunity to enjoy this trip, to learn from it, and in my case, write about it. Perhaps you know where I'm leading. On a trip like this, and it is a trip, its loveliness is not in the sameness of people and things, but in their incredible variety. Eventually, this led me to the Star Trek statement, IDIC, infinite diversity from infinite combinations. Thank whatever created us. We are different, each of us and everything around us. To the end of time, if it ever does end, no combination will ever come up quite the same. That's quite a travel package. All of this is how Star Trek began, and it's also something of what it's about. I am an alien, and so are you. And yet, and this is the loveliest thing of all, somehow we're also part of each other, and part of everything that is. I don't know if this has a